I am Jonathan Humphreys. Welcome to the HoCoSo Conversation. Welcome to HoCoSo Connect, the conversation. This is a conversation with Mr. Alphy Johnson from International Hospitality Advisor, his own firm. He is an expert in managing hotels around the world, and he has had his fair share of managing through and leading through crisis. This is part two. Part one, we covered North America, his time in San Francisco and in Los Angeles for the San Francisco earthquake and the Los Angeles riots. We're now in Asia, in Indonesia, during the financial crisis. I hope you enjoy this podcast. He has been described as the humble innkeeper. He's a man of calmness, collectedness, and at the same time, focus and action. I hope that you appreciate and enjoy this podcast brought to you by HoCoSo Connect, the conversation. Thank you.
All right, Alfie, welcome back.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
To our second session. So we're going to pick up where we left off. We covered the Los Angeles riots and the San Francisco earthquake. And now you had an opportunity to move to Asia. So, Alfie, just give us some background in terms of the move to Asia, what that entailed, and we're going to be talking about Indonesia specifically. So just explain how that occurred.
After leaving Hotel Nico Beverly Hills, I was recruited by Westin to rejoin Westin. I'd worked for them earlier on in my career. They needed somebody to open hotels for them in Asia. And I'd always expressed an interest and kept in touch with Westin because I always wanted to return to Asia. My dad had been there with Pan Am in Bangkok for many years. I really enjoyed the hospitality culture that was evident in Asia. So Westin called me up and said, we have three possibilities. We have Langkawi, Chiang Mai, and Manila. So I said, okay, Chiang Mai sounds great. And they said, oh, is that in China? So I said, no, it's actually in Thailand. It gives you an idea of the geopolitical knowledge of some U.S. companies. They're more advanced than others because they already had opened a hotel in South Africa. It was just a matter of understanding what was going on. At that point, the head office was still in Seattle, but the ownership was in Japan. So that also made for very interesting dynamics. I rejoined Westin to open the Chiang Mai hotel, and that's a whole other very interesting story from a development viewpoint. No real crises there.
Thankfully, they're kind of following you around or not.
Right. A lot of people say that. I'm not sure I want to go where you go. The thing is, I've survived the war. In fact, this kind of ties in with Nico Beverly Hills. When I was first recruiting staff, I wanted to recruit New York salespeople rather than LA salespeople because LA salespeople tend to be fairly laid back, and most of our business was going to be coming from New York. So I wanted somebody who understood the New York market. But they're very hesitant because they were afraid of earthquakes. So I said, just as a point of reference, I've been through a major earthquake in San Francisco. What are the odds of somebody going through two earthquakes in a matter of 2 years? If you have one in a lifetime, the odds of that are 1 in 10,000, whatever. They said, okay, we'll join you. But promise no earthquakes. I said, I can't make that kind of promise, but the odds are that you'll be fine. And so I leave LA. 3 weeks later, big earthquake hits LA. And the sales team calls me and says, you said that. I said, no. I said, while I was there.
Nothing to do with you this time.
Exactly. But all three of them packed up and went back to New York. A little side story. So I opened Westin Chiang Mai, and then I was asked to go to the Tokyo head office for Westin. They wanted to develop a new concept for a mid-market hotel company which would be very Chinese-based. So very elaborate and luxurious public areas, but tiny guest rooms. So I did the whole concept, presented to the board of Westin. They said, yes, we love it, and we want you to head it up. I was able to get out of that because, again, that wasn't my area of expertise. And then they said, okay, we're going to send you to Singapore, and you can be the regional GM for opening hotels. So I was responsible for basically 3 opening hotels, more assisting and preparing, doing all the groundwork for the openings before the GMs arrived. And then Starwood came in, bought Westin.
What year are we talking about now?
We're talking 1995, 96.
Okay.
So I assisted with that. And as I said, Starwood came in. And I figured that being in a regional office on the other side of the world was probably not the best place from a career viewpoint to be. So I said, I really like to get back to operations and open hotels. Okay. And they said, okay, which one would you like to open? I got along very well with the owner in Surabaya. So I said, that's the one. And they said, perfect. By the way, where is Surabaya? I had to explain that it was not near Tokyo at all. It's south of the equator. Again, culturally, it was a very interesting change from Singapore to going to Indonesia. Surabaya is the second largest city in Indonesia. It's still on the island of Java, so mainly a Muslim population. Again, very hospitable people. It was a great opening and a great owner. He and I got along very well. We had a lot of challenges, but we got through them all. We were still in touch until, unfortunately, about 2 years ago when he passed. But I'm still in contact with his son. In fact, I went back to the hotel 3 years ago, and was still warmly welcomed by a lot of the staff. So that's always nice to see. Once I'd opened Surabaya, the Western Surabaya, Rosewood called me and said, we'd like you to come back and open our hotel in Jakarta.
Just for the listeners, there's a couple of points I'd like to just focus on. I know this is early in the story, but, one of the things that I've always been impressed by is the longevity of the relationships that you've kept. The fact that you've been in touch with the owner, since the 90s all the way through to now, and now in contact with his son. And also combined then, as you said, you've rejoined Rosewood. It seems like you're a person that's always kept doors open and relationships going as much as you possibly can anyway. How important is that to you?
To me, it's more a personal relationship than a business relationship. I enjoy meeting people. I like people. And I like to make sure that once we develop a relationship that we keep that going. I think it goes back to my school days where I'm still in touch with friends of mine from who I went to prep school with. It's more than half a century ago.
Yeah, I think it's a great philosophy. And so, a lot of the opportunities you've had in your career have been through relationships that you built up over time or that you've developed and nurtured in some shape or form. And then they've just come back in full circle in some instances, like going back to Rosewood. A lot of people maybe say, I don't want to rejoin a company I've already left. So what was the trigger for you to rejoin Rosewood?
Truth be told, I never wanted to leave. Rosewood went through a very difficult financial period when the price of gas collapsed in the mid-1980s. And our owner, Mrs. Hunt, was in the oil and gas business. And she decided to basically divest herself of most of the non-oil and gas holdings, which included Rosewood hotels. Fortunately, we had a president who had a lot of foresight and said, well, why don't you keep this going? You've already invested so much money in it. Let's keep it going and make it neutral from a cash viewpoint. So we'll make enough money to make sure that we won't be asking you for anything. And she said, okay, keep going. And that's before Rosewood owned all their hotels. And then a gentleman by the name of Atif Makarios, when he was made president, and who had a pleasure of working with before leaving Rosewood, basically went into the management of hotels as an operator. And the first two hotels were Kinneil Bay and Little Dix Bay in the Caribbean. And then the Lanesborough in London. Again, he really turned the company around from losing money to actually being very profitable.
Okay, so it was a company you'd already kept your eye on anyway, and really, if there was an opportunity, you would have looked at it. So
Exactly.
Okay. So they then asked you to move to Jakarta.
Right. So, and it was a very easy move from Surabaya to Jakarta. And I'd invested a lot of time and effort into learning Bahasa Indonesia, the Indonesian language. Number one, it's a very simple language to learn.
Doesn't have different tenses, really, does it?
No tenses. To say something in the plural, you just say the word twice. So, for example, person is orang, people is orang-orang. So even I can learn that. But it has a great culture of hospitality, of food. I was happy to move to Jakarta. And again, since I'd really invested the effort in learning the language, that was very useful. The big difference was that the owner was very different from the owner in Surabaya. The owner of this hotel was the son of the then President Suharto, and so not very engaged. And this was kind of a minor sideline. We were able to agree on things, so it worked out nicely from that viewpoint.
Tell us a little bit about the project itself then.
It was 100 rooms, located in very much a residential part of the city of Jakarta. A great location in the Beverly Hills of Jakarta, except there aren't any hills. It was comprised of 3 or 4 main elements. It was a 100-room hotel. Then there were 2 high-rise condominium residential buildings. Then there was the Mining and Energy Club. Then there was also a spa, which was in the same building as Mining and Energy Club. So it was quite, diverse. And in those days, there weren't that many mixed-use projects. From that viewpoint, it was very interesting. And in Dallas, Rosewood had the Crescent Hotel, and they also had the Crescent Club, which is a private club, and also a spa. And that's what the owners liked, that Rosewood had the experience of managing all 3 and seeing how you can have synergies between those three elements, plus the residential.
Oh, great. So a beautiful project. And the question is, how did this become a crisis in Jakarta and Indonesia? And there were a few waves to this crisis as well, different forms. Let's start at the beginning. What happened and what was your role within the hotel when the crisis struck?
Well, I was the opening managing director, so I was employee probably number 3 when I started there. I mean, similar to opening the Westin in Surabaya, Rosewood was not an established entity in Indonesia. So I had to go through the process of establishing it as a company and doing a lot of the licensing and taking care of that, all the paperwork. The owner's name was very helpful, but the owner himself was not very helpful. So I had to basically find a lawyer who was familiar with it and undertake all of that. So that was interesting. Traffic in Jakarta is horrendous. That was probably the major challenge. The original intent was that we were going to move into one of the condominiums that was being built next to the hotel. But in the meantime, during the pre-opening, it wasn't ready yet and was a long way away from being ready. So we just lived in the service departments, and we had 2 infant kids at the time. It was probably more convenient for my wife to be in a service department than being in a house. That worked out fine. And we didn't have schooling issues or anything like that at that point. So, and again, the hotel was under construction when I got there, and the site had been a site of the former mint of Indonesia. That's where they had all the printing presses and printed all the banknotes and struck all the coins. So the building had some history, and we found out later that it was also used by the secret police for all kinds of nefarious and ugly purposes. So, and that came into play later on, but that's a different story. Then, before we opened, we hosted an OPEC meeting. The OPEC meetings happen twice a year. Once a year, it's in Vienna, and another time, it's in one of the member states. At that point, Indonesia had a lot of clout with OPEC. They managed to convince OPEC that the Dharma Wangsa which was the name of the hotel, would be ready to host an OPEC meeting 6 months from that time, which it's a miracle that we completed everything. But again, in Indonesia, you can accomplish a lot just by throwing a lot of people at it. And
a lot of money.
Yes. Yeah. And showed a lot of power. So we opened with hosting an OPEC meeting, which was a lot of fun. And they'd sent me to an OPEC meeting as part of the Indonesian delegation 6 months before in Vienna, because they wanted me to see what an OPEC meeting was like.
Because obviously you have particular setups for all the member states, and you have all the translation.
Everybody has to be exactly equal. Exactly. And in a hotel, with 100 rooms, that's not always easy.
Just at that time, how many member states were there, roughly? Remember?
I believe it was 8 or 9.
Okay, so you had to make sure that there were 8 or 9 equal rooms at the tables, everything was equally done.
I think we had 10 exact suites that were exactly the same.
Yeah.
Just to make sure.
Yeah, I've done a lot of projects in the GCC, and obviously GCC conference, you have a very similar setup where everything has to be identical, especially for the rotation of those conferences.
You're familiar with that. So we did that. In fact, it was very interesting because when I went to Vienna, I was part of the Indonesian delegation. And so I was fully credentialed. And I was the only person, I kind of stood out, let's put it that way, because I didn't look like a Saudi. I didn't look like a Venezuelan. I didn't look like a Indonesian. Especially I was part of the Indonesian delegation. So every country represented gets 9 seats. 3 at the table and 6 behind, kind of support. Mm-hmm. But the Indonesian delegation was 20-some people. So they didn't have any seats at their table because, I wasn't going to give any input on oil pricing. So they said, well, just sit anywhere we can find a seat. So I found a seat in the Iranian section because they only had 3 people there. Now, needless to say, the Iranians were very nervous.
About having an American.
Well, they're trying to figure out what I was.
Yeah, exactly. Sure.
Because I spoke a little bit German to the staff and spoke a little bit of Arabic and Indonesian, so they were very confused. And then when their delegation arrived in Jakarta, they said, now we know the connection why you were there. We tried looking you up and we couldn't find anything on you. And I said, I'm just a humble innkeeper. Again, that was a very interesting opening. And President Suharto came to close the OPEC meeting and open the hotel all in one session. So that was very nice that he was able to do that. And then one thing you could rely on in the newspaper was that there would be a picture of the president on the front page every day doing something. Whether it's opening a hotel or closing OPEC, we'd be on the front page. Well, we were on the front page, and that is the last time the president was on the front page of the newspaper because he disappeared for 2 weeks after that.
Interesting.
And nobody knew what happened. And so I was summoned to the U.S. Embassy with a bunch of other executives and said, who was the last person to see the president? And it ended up being me. And I'd shaken his hand. So they said, well, how does his hand feel? So I said, it was a very soft handshake, but I understand that's how we shook hands. It was a very soft handshake. And they said, okay, any numbness or anything? Because it ended up he'd had a stroke after leaving the hotel. And I'm so grateful that it happened. I mean, I'm not grateful it happened, but I'm so grateful it happened after he left the hotel, not at the hotel.
Sure. Especially with a big event like that going on as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not a good omen. So.
No, definitely not. When your host doesn't make it out of the gates of the hotel, it's not good.
But that kind of left a power vacuum. There was also an election coming up, and he was still up for election, but he hadn't been seen for a long time. And what happens in Indonesia is that all the parties can have rallies, but on a specific day of the week. So you never have two different parties having a rally on the same day, which kind of makes sense because people get very excited during political rallies. And then what was important is that if you're driving around, that you had a flag of the color of that particular party that was rallying that day, just to show your support for them, because then you avoid a lot of traffic problems that way. So we did that. On a Sunday, our family just been to the pool at a club, and we're driving back. And through the local staff, we had a very good idea as to what was going on where in the city. If there's going to be a demonstration someplace, they said, this is where it's going to be, go the other way. And I used to make a point of driving my own car on Sundays because I want to give the driver the day off. So coming back, I knew the way, and then as we're driving out, the police saw that we had a green flag because it was a day for the Muslim party to rally. So what he did was, instead of showing the way where there were no rallies going on, he steered us right into the middle of a demonstration.
Okay.
Here we are, family of four, and we're being steered straight into the middle of the demonstration. And, this policeman had done the same thing to others leaving ahead of us. So we saw what was happening up front. So the other cars, they're opening the doors, yanking out the driver, we're yanking out the expat and roughing them up a bit.
Okay.
I said, great. But there's nowhere we could go. We were stuck, thousands of people around us. And so then the organizers came to us, and I spoke to him in my little bit of Bahasa Indonesia. He was very helpful and explained I'm here with my family because they really respect family a lot. And he looked inside and said, please, can we go home? He said, yeah, okay, follow me. So he just basically left the parting of the Red Sea. He cleared a way for us to go out, and we went off home.
Well, I guess you were pretty nervous during that, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I've been in a similar situation in Algiers where the driver took the wrong turn into the Casbah area, and the car was surrounded by, I would say, people that weren't particularly happy that I had driven into their neighborhood. And, we had to get out of there pretty quickly, but I was alone, right? So let alone having my family with me.
Yes, but I think having family in there really saved me. So it was great to have them there. And our little son, Brandon, he was waving that little green flag like crazy when the guy put his head through the windows. And I said my salams and used the cultural niceties.
Alfie, these demonstrations and rallies were a precursor to the financial and economic crisis, which was potentially on the horizon, although it didn't come straight to fruition. Can you explain the sequence of events?
Certainly. The election was pretty much at the forefront of everybody's mind at this time, and the economy was still humming along nicely. But then the Asian currency crisis hit, and I believe Thailand was the first one where this was felt. And essentially the currencies of these booming economies were overinflated and overheated, and they kind of came back down to earth with a crash. And this was particularly true in Indonesia. Now, the situation in Indonesia was that many of the bank loans were in US dollar denomination. And the reason for that was that local currency loans, their interest rates were 18-20%, whereas the US dollar denominated loans were about 7 to 8% interest. Which do you choose? A 20% interest rate or an 8% interest? Everybody gravitated towards the dollar loans. The challenge was that when the currencies devalued, it took a lot more rupiah to buy those dollars to pay the interest and the principal. And that really bankrupted a lot of hotel projects and businesses, and quite frankly, the country too.
Let's just explain how that plays out, right? Because you've got, let's say for hotel operations, you've got US dollar debt on the property,
right,
or loan. However, the revenues, the majority of the costs are in rupiah, okay, local currency, local salaries, you're buying local. Obviously, if you're importing, maybe you have to pay in dollars for certain things. The
like
rates,
expat salaries.
Yeah, expat salaries are in dollars, right? But sometimes the pricing is linked to the US dollar amount, but in those days, maybe not. Was it in rupiah that people paid, or was it the equivalent in US dollars? So how would that be affected on the profit line, and why would the loans be at risk?
Well, all our rates were quoted in US dollars.
Yeah.
And it was not just our hotel, it was all the hotels, which number one meant that local business disappeared because,
Agreed. They couldn't afford to pay for the local accounts, you mean?
Exactly. And just give you an idea of the amount of the difference in exchange rates. Before the rupiah, the Indonesian rupiah, was pegged to about 2,000 rupiah per $1 US. During the crisis, it was 15,000 rupiah to the US dollar. So that's almost 8 times.
Okay.
So imagine, we'll just call the room rate $100. So now suddenly to an Indonesian, your room rate is $800.
Yeah, the equivalent. Yeah. So what happened to the occupancies of the hotel then during that time?
The occupancies of our hotel were fine, and they'd been fine ever since the riots had really started or the rallies had started, because we were in this very exclusive residential neighborhood that was extremely well guarded. There weren't going to be any protesters coming anywhere near it. So we were kind of regarded as a safe haven. A lot of major oil companies moved their top executives from their homes into our hotel. So occupancy was very good, especially since we'd only just opened. So it was very good from that viewpoint. And it was to the point where the U.S. government was looking to evacuate or plan for evacuations of citizens. And we had buildings on 4 sides and a huge park in the middle. And so people from the U.S. Embassy came and said, we need a place to land helicopters, take some of these people out. Do you mind if we cut down some of your trees? So I said, sorry, but no. I mean, these were trees that were more than 100 years old, and we weren't going to cut down trees just in case they need to fly helicopters in there. And so they said, okay. And so they brought in a pilot. The pilot said, I can fly in here anyway. You can leave the trees. I'm glad I said no. And I said, and yes, you're very welcome to use this area. We'll do whatever we can. But the price is that you evacuate all the expat staff that we have.
Why did the expat staff need evacuating? I think, there's obviously a gap that needs to be filled here. So we've gone from a currency crisis, right, which is obviously the rupiah and the devaluation of that. Why do we get to a point where the staff need to be evacuated when the hotel's already at a good occupancy level?
Right. We didn't get to that point, but we were just planning in that eventuality.
Okay, why were you planning for that eventuality?
The country was a tinderbox, and fortunately it did not explode and catch fire as it might have. But again, we wanted to be prepared.
Explain to the audience why there was the risk of that situation. Why would it have gone into an anarchistic state or situation based on what was going on with the currencies? Why were you fearful of it, and why were you scenario planning for it?
Essentially, yes, there was a crisis, and the president hadn't been seen for, I think, about 2 months at that point. So there was a vacuum at the top, and people were trying to fill that vacuum. And some of the people who were trying to fill that vacuum were on the more radical side. So the odds of it happening that we'd have to evacuate were maybe 30%. But again, you want to make sure that you have a plan in place in case that happened.
All right. So it's just a possibility that you were already planning for. So there's a currency crisis. How is that manifesting itself in an economic crisis? So what's going on? I mean, business is suddenly in a situation that they can't pay for goods that they're importing. You've got companies that can't service loans. You've got a lot of bankruptcies. So as a consequence, I presume you're starting to see a lot of social tensions.
Absolutely, because a lot of hotels were starting to lay off people. So that was a concern of the staff. I met with staff members in departments, again, more on an individual basis, and had kind of sessions to let them know what was happening and what our situation was, that we were here to take care of our guests. And if they felt uncomfortable being at the hotel, just let us know. We'll take care of that. But they would still be on the payroll. That was the main concern. Because again, a lot of the people working in service business really live from paycheck to paycheck. So it made sense to put them at ease in that regard. And also the staff was so supportive because again, they were our contact local community and gave us a lot of information as to what was going on, what we should say, what we shouldn't say. So from that viewpoint, it was very helpful to have that. Now, from a purchasing viewpoint and the essential essentials for keeping the restaurants open. It was essential that we kept those things open. Fortunately, we had 2 restaurants, and they both served primarily food from Indonesia. So we didn't have to import very much.
Okay.
Now, the one area that did hit us was that we couldn't import any alcohol because the prices were just exorbitant. And so once our supply ran out, that was it.
Sure.
But people understood that and were happy with that. One of the main problems was attaining the quality of the produce that we needed. For example, chickens. A lot of Indonesian food is based on chicken, or ayam, as they call it. And all their chicken feed was imported, so they weren't able to feed the chickens. So our first indication was that the chickens were getting smaller and smaller and smaller because they didn't have the feed to make them grow. And eventually, there were no chickens and no eggs. So we just had to change our menu and see how to do that. Our chef, Dutch gentleman, Chef Jans, he'd worked in Indonesia for many years and had very good connections with distributors and purveyors, and we took good care of them. So we were able to get good fresh fish and beef, not so much pork. That was kind of not on the menu, so...
being a Muslim country. Anyway.
Yes.
So, okay, there's a combination of things happening. So you're able to maintain the staff, which obviously in that situation is pretty unique, but it's because there's an interest by I presume because of the son of the president, and there's also a reputational situation. Also, you've got good occupancies. So there's a combination of effects. But under normal circumstances, there wouldn't be a government to step in to support those employees once they had been laid off, right?
No, there's no social parachute. There's no unemployment or anything like that.
Yeah, which is what we're seeing today, right?
Network.
Across the whole of Asia, well, most of Asia, sorry, not the whole of Asia, because China is stepping in and supporting from a government perspective. But the rest of Asia is struggling. Middle East is a similar situation. North Africa is a similar situation. A lot of governments, whether the hotel's been mandated or not to close because of what's going on today with the virus, then they're in a situation where they can't keep those people on. And then we're also seeing the supply chain effects, right? Which is what was just mentioned there. I mean, something as simple as chicken feed, you wouldn't really think about on the supply chain, but we are going to see a lot of supply chain effects going on, which haven't yet filtered through the system because we've got probably a lot of stock that's still available that's being used.
Except toilet paper.
So sort of very yeah.
And I think there's quite a few similarities because also we had no idea how long this was going to last. Same with the coronavirus. We don't know how long this is going to last. So trying to plan for the future when you don't know when the future is can be a challenge. And also, the currency didn't crash at once. It kind of slid rapidly, but we didn't know when that slide was going to stop. Instead of the coronavirus graphs going up, this one, the graph of the currency was going down. Again, we didn't know where that valley bottom was going to be. I was having to communicate with the owners who were very well informed at the top level, but not necessarily on the ground level as to what we were doing, but also informing our head office in Dallas what was going on. I said, it's coming to the point where it's just not sustainable to have an expat GM here because we used to get paid once a month in cash. And it used to come in a little brown lunch bag. And my last month there, my pay, it took 6 big grocery bags full of cash.
Okay, so you were being paid in rupiah, not in US dollars in those days?
Yes, it was the rupiah equivalent of my US salary. Again, that was 8 times as much. And also I said, this is not sustainable. And also I knew that all the people who'd been staying in the hotel would probably soon be pulled back to their home countries for the very same reason. The local companies just could not afford to pay expats.
Sure. So was the occupancy declining at this point?
Not yet. I think we're still around 70-80%.
But you were still scenario planning for this. So you was already starting to have these discussions and dialogue, which is quite interesting because what I've really noticed about this situation is it's happened so fast, the impact regarding the coronavirus. A lot of companies didn't have much time to plan for this. But looking back, there were plenty of warning signals that this thing was coming, even meetings where we tried to raise it as a topic of conversations to talk about planning. It was kind of negated to a certain effect. But you were really taking a proactive role. So I guess my question is, how were you able to see what the possibilities were and act on them rather than just be an observer to them and say, we're doing fine. We're at 70-80% occupancy and we'll be okay. What gave you the instinct that things weren't going to be fine?
Well, my philosophy is hope for the best and plan for the worst. So we were planning for the worst.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the worst was happening. And also the police were very much seen as President Suharto's enforcement arm. I mean, the police and the army were really taking a lot of the brunt of the anger of the people. Fortunately, it wasn't directed towards foreigners, but more towards the power structure there.
Yeah. The reason I'm nodding, I was out there probably not too long after this. I was working for Meridian, and I ended up in Bali, which was also a hotel which was owned by the Suharto family. And also I was in Bangkok pretty much around that time in Thailand, so aware of what was going on in the region. So it was a big challenge, really, to get a sense.
And I think the similarities are also in that with the coronavirus, it didn't start off being an economic crisis, but I think it's rapidly becoming, in fact, it already is an economic crisis.
I think it already is, right?
Yes,
we're now in an economic crisis. The challenge that you are facing there is obviously, I like the idea that you kind of hope for the best and plan for the worst. I have a question regarding that, actually. So in a lot of the companies I've worked for and with, negative news or talking about the potential of negative events doesn't necessarily go down very well. Even if you're scenario planning, people tend to go, yeah, that's unlikely. We'll forget about that bit. If you're kind of approaching things from that perspective, how did you get buy-in with people with regards to your philosophy? I think it's a sensible one. You know, we've been speaking with a lot of people who I would say that they are very astute with regards to crisis management. And one of the things that's becoming apparent is that this scenario planning has not taken place, at least within our sector, not within the hospitality sector.
Right.
So how were you able to have that constructive dialogue with supervisors and stakeholders that allowed you to have a good dialogue about these things that was objective and pragmatic rather than an emotional one?
Well, I was very fortunate in that the owners of Rosewood are in the oil and gas business.
Yeah.
The business in Indonesia is oil and gas. Yeah. So they were very well connected with that industry. And when I first started having discussions with Dallas, I asked, please ask the Hunts what they're hearing from their equivalents at other major oil companies. Because at that point, ExxonMobil was based just outside Dallas, and there was a whole bunch of them. And I knew they all kind of talking the same. And then they came back to me the next day and said, we are preparing for the worst. So that, again, it's data and not my data.
Yeah, I think that's really good because I think we have a myopic view sometimes of our sector and looking out at other sectors to see what's happening with them, how they're responding, what crisis is impacting them, especially at these current times. It allows you to see how the dots are connected and then also see where the run is happening and how you're potentially going to be implicated along that. Because to be fair, travel and tourism normally is one of the first to be impacted as a consequence of events, right? As you mentioned, as soon as it became too expensive for companies locally because they couldn't afford it anymore, then you get impacted. But it's the companies getting impacted first. So
I'd say that hospitality is probably not a leading indicator, but it's probably in the middle. I'd say a leading indicator is probably the airlines. Initially, they'll have a big bump as people are getting out. Then all the traffic is one way. And then, so they're losing half their business. Again, the same with the hotel. We had a lot of people checking in, and then when people checked out, I mean, that was it. We had no more.
Which was what's happening everywhere at the moment, right?
Exactly. But I think being an economic issue, as both the Jakarta and current global issue is, I think it's going to take longer to recover. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's going to take longer to recover than it took for the impact to hit. Because again, I think people are looking for recovery, but people are going to be more cautious.
You had the currency crisis, which actually, to be fair, we haven't really yet seen, but we've had the economic crisis, which is now happening here. How long was the economic crisis going on for in Indonesia? And then what about the social unrest? Because that was a consequence of that economic crisis. And explain what was going on with the hotel in those times as well, with a transfer from the economic to the social crisis that started to occur.
Right. Well, the election was taking place. Then if I remember correctly, again, I might not have all my facts correct here, but I seem to recall that the election was postponed and an interim president was named. His name is Mr. Habibie, and he was a very smart guy, but he was a bureaucrat and not a leader. And then he was deposed, and I think that's when they went ahead with the elections, and a opposition party came in, and that calmed down the political.
Okay.
And also, quite frankly, gave the money markets more confidence in Indonesia.
So all of this situation on the currency and the economy and then the social crisis was all created by just a power vacuum?
Yeah.
Just Suharto having a stroke, basically, and not being becoming visible?
Well, it had been building up because there's more and more corruption going on with his family. So, and the people were saying, okay, enough is enough, because here we are dirt poor and we see the president and his family driving around in very expensive cars, having homes here, there, and everywhere. Where's our piece? Because Indonesia is a very rich country if you look at mineral resources and human resources.
Yeah, I mean, since the discovery of oil, right? I mean, in the 60s, I mean, you could literally track Indonesia and Nigeria as the two countries discovering oil around the same time. Fortunately, today, Indonesia's done pretty well. If you look at it now as a timescale today, I think they learned their lessons from the 80s, the 90s.
That generation is still around. Yeah,
exactly. So in terms of takeaways here, one was, in terms of scenario planning, I like the idea of kind of hoping for the best, planning for the worst. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was the fact that you were basically saying extract yourself from this situation because the cash flows are no longer viable, right? If I'm kind of interpreting this correctly, you're kind of saying, look, the general management salary here doesn't make any sense at the moment.
Exactly.
That's a bold statement. I mean, most general managers or most management want to try and stay in their positions as long as possible in a crisis, right? But you raise your hand and say, look, this doesn't make any sense anymore. I think it's a brave move. Can you explain your thinking on that and how applicable that is today? Obviously, we've seen management taking or senior management taking pay cuts, and sometimes you wonder whether it's for PR, but we'll leave that aside. I think sometimes there's some goodwill in there as well. But how genuine is it? How important is it that it is genuine? And whose interests were you really looking out for on that basis?
My original plan, and with Rosewood's agreement, was that this was going to be a 2-year assignment because I had a fairly significant salary and it was just not sustainable for this size of operation and responsibilities. And essentially, my mission of opening the hotel, the club, the spa were done. And I had a very capable number 2, and he was ready. So it made sense to move up that timeline, and that's what we're doing. Then they kindly offered me a position in Dallas, which ended up being the VP of rooms. It worked out for everybody. But so I was still very much involved with the hotel because it was still one of my hotel's responsibility for 2 years until I moved to Saudi. But when the economic crisis hit, the owners didn't want to pay the management fees. So Dallas said, okay, don't worry about it. Pick it up once the economy recovers. Well, 4 years later, when I get back from Saudi, I looked at the accounts receivable and they still weren't paying.
But
and
even though the economy had picked up by then, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, had nobody picked up on this, or was this just an ongoing dispute?
No, it wasn't a dispute. They just weren't paying, and nobody was asking them to pay.
Okay.
And the president, he'd been told that, oh, no, this is an arrangement because of the financial situation, and this person was not that familiar with anything outside of Texas. So I brought it up in one of the Monday morning meetings, executive meetings. I said, well, why haven't they paid? They said, oh, well, they say that, they can't pay yet. I said, have you looked at the numbers? They're making a ton of money.
Yeah, of course.
So they said, okay, Alfie, go and take care of it. So off I went, and I was able to come back with, I think it was half of the money owed. So maybe very popular in Dallas.
I'm sure. That's over a 4-year period. That's a big chunk of change.
Yeah, bonuses were good that year. And then they paid for about 3 months. Then they stopped paying again. I said, oh, it's too difficult to pay. We just paid you all this amount. Can you let it? And I said, no. So the president said, okay, Alfie, please go and work your magic again. So I went back and they'd assembled the board of directors. So it was little old me and, these very powerful Indonesian gentlemen, all ex-military or military. And they said, sorry, we're not going to pay you. I said, okay, as long as you understand that there will be repercussions. They said, well, what do you mean? You're choosing not to do something. So as a result, we will have to act accordingly. They said, well, what do you mean? I said, we will take a measured response and act accordingly. Okay, but we still can't pay you. I said, okay, thank you. It'd be nice chatting with you. And so I left. Fortunately, I had an old iPod. And since I'm the only person there, I decided I'm going to record this meeting just in case anything happens.
Yeah.
So I went back to Dallas and said, sorry. The president said, okay, what should we do? I said, send them 30 days. We'll terminate in 30 days if we don't get the money. He said, are we prepared to lose it? I said, what are we losing?
Yeah, you're not getting any money anyway.
Exactly. He said, yeah, you're right. So we sent a letter. On day 30, the owner's representative called the president and told him what a terrible person I was. And the president, I have to tell him, he said, actually, he was acting on my behalf. So I'm the terrible person. Pay or there'll be consequences.
Yeah.
Because I told the president the whole story. And he said, oh, well, what are you going to do? He said, there'll be consequences. So, well, we can't pay. I said, okay. The next day, we basically sent a notice of termination, shut off the reservation system, and that was it.
And they never paid?
They never paid. No.
Okay. But you got half the money.
Exactly, which is more than they would have had otherwise. But I was still in touch with people on the board. And once they're out of the meeting, then they're very different people.
Of course, yeah. I mean, everybody has a role to play, right?
Yeah. I didn't take it personally that they weren't paying me.
I think it's a great story. Thanks for kind of closing the loop on that. And the fact that you're still in touch with the owners and also your colleagues from Rosewood. But one of the things that I wanted to draw out from your story was the fact that Rosewood, they were asking you to troubleshoot based on your experience. What is it in terms of as a personality or as an attitude that is really helpful that you've been able to show time and time again during a crisis that people are very confident with your ability to cope in these situations? Because, I mean, you're obviously in these situations. Yeah, you're able to get through them. You're able to keep everybody on board. I mean, we kind of touched on that in the last podcast as well, with regards to keeping all the different stakeholders on board and things like that. There's an attitude and part of your personality, which is, it's like, well, Alfie's the man. He can solve this, you know? And that's how they saw you at Rosewood. That's why they asked you to do these things. And also when you had your time at all the different companies. So what do you think it is? And the reason I'm asking is for the audience who are listening, currently undergoing this crisis, what is it that they can reflect on that helps them get through this crisis from an attitude and a personality or mentality perspective?
Well, I find it difficult to speak for myself, but I'll tell you what other people have told me. Basically, they find that I'm a very calming influence. I take stock of the big picture to see what's happening. I take care of the people. And of course, as I mentioned in the first podcast, family first, and recognize not just my family, but other people's families as well. And just keeping a cool head. I mean, sometimes I've been in situations, especially the Riyadh incident that we'll discuss next time, is that yes, you keep cool head during the event. Then afterwards, you kind of reflect and say, what did I do? Or how did I do that? After the Riyadh incident, I did a radio interview for NPR in the US. And so my family members were very upset that I was so calm. They couldn't believe I could be that calm the morning after the attack.
Yeah, I've listened to that interview. I mean, it's really impressive.
And also keeping focus on what is my responsibility. My responsibility is to lead a group of professionals who are there to take care of guests and people and just take care of that. And also understanding the relationships, and again, building those relationships ahead of time in case. Again, you don't build a relationship in case something goes wrong. You just build relationships.
Are there any techniques you use for staying so calm, Alfie? You know, there must be certain days we'll come on to that one in Saudi, but even during this particular crisis, you've got the currency crashing, the hotels are closing around you, businesses just falling all over the place. Is there anything kind of personally that you do? Do you have like a routine or deep breathing? Or because staying calm and focused, somehow they're opposite, but yet together they work really well. And you see very focused people that they're super energetic and they're all over the place. Then you see very calm people that are, frankly, the action doesn't come. So it's a combination of this calmness, the focus, and then the action that comes together, which I think is a very important combination. But do you have a particular technique for doing that or a particular way of preparing yourself?
Yeah, preparation is the big thing. And having a potential plan or a plan similar to what you might expect, that there will be a crisis. I've been telling people, especially friends of mine who also invest in the stock market, and this was back in October, November of last year, I said, something is going to happen. I don't know what, we don't know when, we don't know where, but this has been going on for too long. So I pulled out 30% of my investments. And also, I think the experience helps tremendously. You know,
Sure.
We've been through that. We had a house fire in Buffalo. We were in the UK at the time, but our house was severely damaged by the fire in Buffalo, New York. And the arson investigator, when we got back, thought that we had said it. And we said, why do you think? He said, well, you're so calm. So basically, we went through some of the things that our family had gone through. And they said, that explains it. Now I get it. So it was just all those previous experiences. And you can basically build on those experiences and also reflecting on those experiences to see what could you have done better? What could the team have done better? And planning for next time. You know, COVID-19, it's not as if we haven't had these kind of things happen before. We had SARS, we had MERS, we had Ebola, we had Spanish flu in 1919. My grandfather died from.
Oh, really?
Okay. So we know these things are going to happen, but what's going to happen, that's the big mystery. If you can foretell that, be a very rich man. But to answer your question, I think it's just in my nature to be calm and get on with it.
I think that's a great note to end on. Stay calm and get on with it.
Yeah.
Let's not overcomplicate things today. That combination is really helpful in itself. Alfie, that was great. Thank you very much for the time that we've spent together on this and covering your time in Asia. It's another perspective on things, also another crisis, what one can have a look at and do within a crisis as well. So thank you very much, Alfie.